The most important outcome for a student of probability and statistics is improved statistical literacy. Now, we've heard the word literacy, and to us that means, understanding language. Well, statistical literacy just means understanding the basic language of statistics, knowing what statistical terms and symbols mean, and having the ability to read statistical graphs. And we also want to understand some fundamental ideas of statistics. So your goal is going to be to improve your ability to see the big picture and to consider relevant factors when presented with a study that claims to prove one thing or another. In other words, you want to sharpen your critical thinking skills and your ability to make sense of results. You want to be able to call on your knowledge of statistical thinking to question certain factors. So when presented with a statistical study, we want to question certain factors such as context. Is there a description of the data, including where it came from? Why was this data collected anyway? Source of the data. Is this data objective, or could there be some incentive for the data to be biased? Examples of that are when, say, a cigarette company pays for the research to determine if cigarettes cause cancer. That actually happened many years ago. That whole issue's been settled now, but that's something that was obviously questionable at the time. Sampling method. Was the sample selected randomly? We've mentioned that random sampling is going to be critical. Was it done randomly? Was the sample a voluntary response sample? A voluntary response sample is where the respondents themselves decide whether or not to participate. We get these all the time. That's when you get that phone call and somebody just wants a few minutes of your time to ask you a few questions, and you say, no thank you, or you give them some time. You have voluntarily decided to participate, or you have opted out of that. But you're choosing whether or not to be part of the sample. It's not the researcher randomly sampling. Voluntary response samples are not usually considered valid, but we know they're used a lot because you do get some information. When they stand at the door of a department store as you walk in, and they want to stop you and ask you some questions about your shopping habits or things like that. Again, only those that are really interested in talking about this are going to stop or have time to do that. It's a selection of the participant or the respondent to decide whether or not to participate. Now, the store may get some really good information from those samples, but it's not really a valid statistical study for research type thing. But that doesn't mean these type voluntary response samples aren't used. It's just they're usually not considered a valid way to collect data, to select your sample. Okay, well, an important component of this critical thinking is knowing when a conclusion or a result is statistically significant or not. And once we decide there is a statistical significance, well, the next thing is to think about, well, is this practically significant? So let's look at what we mean by those two terms. So we have statistical significance and practical significance. What we mean by statistical significance, this is where we are concerned with whether a research result is due to chance, or sample variability. So obviously, when you take a sample, you may come up with one mean for that sample. If you're asking students, again, you're getting responses on what their commute distance is to campus. Okay, so you take one randomly selected sample, good technique, get a mean, but if you do it again the next day or another time and you do it again, get a nice random sample, the mean may not be that exact number that you got the day before. probably won't be. There is some sample variability, but we can conduct tests then further on, and we will be learning how to do this later, to determine whether or not our sample result is something that we can draw conclusions with or not. But once we determine, if we say it is, if we say this sample does give us good data, and we can draw conclusions about the population, then we've determined it is statistically significant. But is it practically significant? And by that we mean we're concerned with whether the result is useful in the real world. So just because something's statistically significant doesn't mean it's all that great a piece of information that we can do something with. Okay, so let's maybe look at an example that'll help us understand these two terms, statistically significant and practically significant. So suppose we give 1,000 adults an IQ test to determine if there is a difference between male and female IQ scores. And say our results are that the mean score for males is 98 and the mean score for females is 100. So then we go further with this and conduct statistical analyses that conclude that the difference in the IQ scores is significant. And with such a large sample, that's not surprising. We probably would find, if we can sample 1,000 adults, that this is statistically significant. But is it practically significant? Just 2 IQ points, do you really see an application there where you would say, well, a female would always then perform better on a certain test or something than a male because of those 2 IQ points? No, that difference is so small that it's really not that great of information. We would say that, well, big deal, 2 points, that's not practically useful. We're not going to go off and make decisions now. We're not going to only hire females for certain jobs or something like that just because of those 2 points. That's a very, very small difference. So statistically significant, yes. Practically significant, not so much.